Hello, I'm Ken Brower, your host for this week's segment, Wilderness. You are probably wondering, what is Wilderness? It is an exploration of TV medium by the Monday, Wednesday, Friday media production class. What we have tried to do is produce a show that is enjoyable and informative, a show that students can identify with. For this week, we have a couple of good comedy scripts and also a fine guitarist, Dana Barry. We also have a documentary, The Beatles. So let's get on with this week's segment of Wilderness, starting with The Beatles.
The Beatles' career began here in the United States with their first appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show. But John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr soon launched themselves into bigger things. The release of their first movie, A Hard Day's Night, in 1964, made them instant favorites throughout the world. Then, in 1965, their second movie, Help, was released. This proved to be an even bigger hit than their first. The doors. Help me if you can, I'm feeling down, and I do appreciate you being around. The Beatles shone here at a press conference before what was to be their last American appearance. This was in 1965 at Shea Stadium. It was at this news conference that John made his famous Christ statement. Later that year, the Beatles announced that touring was a bit tough, and they decided to stop. It was also in that year the Beatles' image changed from this to this. Along with the change in image, the Beatles' music changed, and the proof of this was the release of their Sgt. Pepper album. The Beatles then, in 1967, went through what was called a psychedelic drug phase. They also had regular meditation sessions with their Maharishi.
When I get to the bottom, I go back to the top of the slide, where I stop and I turn and I go for a ride, till I get to the bottom and I see you again.
Then, in the year 1968, the image changed again, and their new music matured even more. With the release of the double white cover album early in 1969. Then, suddenly, in that same year, fans began discovering that the Beatles were trying to tell them something. What fans had found were clues to the Paul McCartney death scare. The scare actually began with the Rubber Soul album. Just the name meant that there was a false soul somewhere in one of the Beatles. On the Sgt. Pepper album, Paul has a hand over his head.
In Greek mythology, the hand over the head means death has come or is coming. There are still more clues to the scare. The yellow marijuana plant is in the shape of a P for Paul. Also, the plant themselves spell the word Paul with a question mark after it. On the inside cover, Paul is shown wearing a patch on his uniform. It is said to mean officially pronounced dead. On the back of the album, Paul has his back to the living. Closer investigation shows that George's thumb points to the day and time of death, Wednesday morning at 5 o'clock. The album is also to have been dipped in blood. On the Magical Mystery Tour album, Paul, not John, is wearing the walrus suit. The black walrus meant death in ancient times. Further on in the album, Paul is pictured above a sign that states, "I was." In another picture, the Beatles are playing together. Paul is not wearing his shoes. Closer examination shows the shoes to have spots of blood on them. This symbolizes, had the real McCartney been here, he would have been in those shoes, the false Paul standing barefoot to the left of the shoes. One of the last pictures in Magical Mystery Tour is the Beatles dancing. The three Beatles wear red roses, while Paul wears a black rose. A closer look at the picture shows streaks just below and to the right of the black rose, meaning it was painted on after the film was made. Here is a picture of Paul as he appeared before his supposedly untimely death in 1966. Here is a picture of the man who took his place. As you can see, the resemblance is amazing. Meet William Campbell, Paul's imposter. This picture came from the poster in the white cover album. The clues continued, and to this date, stopped with the release of the Abbey Road album late in 1969. The whole left side of the album is a cemetery, quite appropriate. John is the Christ-like figure, leading on to the grave. Ringo, the mortician. Paul, again, the barefooted corpse. Only this time his toes are curled to signify decomposition of the body. And last but not least, George dressed as the gravedigger. Now, as we leave the Paul McCartney death scare, we emphasize we do not think Paul is dead. In that same year, John decided to call it quits with his beautiful wife Cynthia Lennon. So, exit Cynthia, enter Yoko Ono. It was also, at this time, people began to think the Beatles were falling apart. Even though there were smiles on the album covers, people were certain that the dream was at an end. Then, early in 1970, the Beatles released a single, Let It Be. Then it was released as an album and turned into a hit movie. This seemed to rule out the facts of any rift between the four. Then, Paul McCartney filed suit in an English court to dissolve him from Apple Records, the Beatles' own company, and the group. The music world was shocked to think that never again would the Beatles be whole. This fear was made more imminent with the surge of solo albums and solo performances by all four Beatles. Seven years that changed the world. And in that 7 years, we have seen many things. Some strange, some unbelievable. Is it the end, or is it the beginning?
And now for the musical portion of Wilderness, we present Dana Barry.
All right, your money or your life?
Charleston, Charleston, made in Carolina. Some dance, some prance. I'll say there's nothing finer than the Charleston, Charleston. Lord, how you can shuffle. Every step you do leads to something new. Man, I'm telling you, it's a lot to rock dance, wing dance. Will be a back number, but the Charleston, the new Charleston, that dance is surely a summer sometime. You dance it one time, the dance called the Charleston, made in South Carolina.
People never looking on your mind. People acting so blind, one of a kind, laughing from their wine. Yeah, yeah. No, no, no. Lucky people never looking up mother's pain. Knowing that she's saying, yeah, yeah. No, always looking, always looking, always looking, always looking on our minds.
Good evening. I'm Rufus Scotty.
And I'm Jerry Waxman.
3 alarm fires swept through an area of Midtown Manhattan today. Miraculously, there were no fatalities. However, 14 people were slightly injured. 5 wasps, 4 Polacks, 3 wetbacks, and 2 jungle bunnies.
And a partridge in a pear tree.
Today in the United Nations, the Security Council again voted on the issue of admitting the red chinks. There were 6 votes for admission, 4 abstentions, coming from the Nips, the Krauts, the Limeys, and the Frog Eaters. As expected, there was 1 negative vote from the Nationalist Chinks.
President Nixon announced today the appointment of a multiracial committee to promote racial harmony in public schools. Appointed to the committee were 6 honkies, 4 spades, 3 spicks, and a fruit. Well, that's the news for tonight. Good night, Hebe.
Good night, Spaghetti Bender.
Little Johnny Winter for you blues fans.